Welcome back to You Must Be Woking, the podcast where we have honest and sometimes tough conversations on the topic of diversity and inclusion with her, Dawn Hurst.
And him, Craig Richards.
In today's episode, we're exploring the concept of diversity quotas and affirmative or positive action versus positive discrimination, what it means, why it matters, and how it can impact your teams and your workplace culture. Shall we catch up? How you been?
I've been really good, thank you. Yes, had a bit of a makeover, to
Very
make
nice.
up for this whole media stardom and all of this good stuff.
Your hair is looking rather fabulous, very dark. But I remember you years ago with dark hair, though. So you used to be dark a long, long time. Well, I think when we first met about 20 years ago.
I did. And it's really funny because I met a couple of contacts this week who I haven't seen for years and they never said anything. And I thought, they remember me from before. So that's quite cool. So what about you?
Well, yeah, I've been busy as always. Jake's doing well. I went to an event this week, which was really interesting. So in the UK Parliament, in the House of Commons, the Mr. Speaker had an LGBT history celebration event. So I was invited along to that, which was really good, actually. Lots of lovely guests there. And the evening was pretty much just made up of, some nice speeches from people, MPs, from different people just talking about progress around LGBT and all of that kind of stuff. There was a lovely tribute to Alan Turing. And then I met lots of different people, but I met a charitable organisation called Fighting with Pride. Okay. And they have been campaigning basically for reparations for military personnel that were exited from the army for being gay back in the day, that kind of stuff. And they were saying how they've just managed to agree what the settlement's going to be from government and all of that good stuff. Not as much as they obviously would have wanted, but unfortunately they don't have the leverage anymore because of the time passing and stuff. But yeah, met a lovely guy called Tony. So hello, Tony, and thanks for filling me in on the Fighting with Pride stuff. But yeah, it was a really, really nice event. So yeah, really good. Nice way to celebrate LGBT History Month. So thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Yes, love that.
Should we get into today?
Stuff.
Yeah, let's get into it, shall we?
Yeah.
Really good. Okay, so as always, we'll start the show with a news article related to the topic we're going to talk about. So obviously, diversity quotas and positive, or if you're in America, affirmative action and versus positive discrimination. So this article was in The Telegraph, which is a broadsheet in the UK. And it was just a couple of days ago, actually, where NHS hospitals set race quotas to win diversity awards was the headline. 30 trusts join a program requiring boards to have a minimum numbers of Black, Asian, minority, ethnic directors in order to achieve gold status. So that was their kind of headline and sub-headline. So I'll read just a little bit more because I think it gives a bit more context. So those NHS hospitals have signed up to an anti-racism awards scheme that asks them to meet race quotas. 30 trusts have joined, which will require them to have minimum numbers of directors from Black, Asian, minority, ethnic backgrounds if they're to achieve this gold status. Steve Barclay, who's the former health secretary, has now come out and said crew targets such as racial quotas were the wrong approach, adding the NHS should have a relentless focus on developing a meritocracy, not hitting arbitrary ideological targets, which can distort behaviours in an organisation. Wes Streeting, on the other hand, so the current health secretary in the UK, said the absence of black staff from NHS boardrooms was glaring, but warned against any type of exercise that amounted to box ticking. He said, jobs should always be given on merit, but I refuse to believe a lack of talent explains the absence of black leaders in top NHS jobs. EDI, Equality, Diversity and Inclusion Initiative, should not be there as some sort of box-ticking or time-wasting exercise. They should tackle genuine health inequalities for patients, as well as rooting out workplace discrimination. So, great way to start the show. Good article. What did you think? What's your initial thoughts about that?
I find this topic quite contentious, I've got to be honest, because if we think about why people even feel we need affirmative action, it's actually based in systemic underrepresentation or even discrimination. So I do have some sympathy for those organisations who feel they have no option. But in terms of this particular article, there's again several layers. Of course, we want to meet the needs of the patient and we want to be reflective of the patients that we're delivering a service to. But by focusing purely on a target and not quality and not the genuine skills and experience that people have, there are so many issues, which I'm sure we'll go into.
Yeah, 100%. And I guess if nothing else, one of the issues is that person, whoever gets appointed to the role, has to then walk around with this stigma of, did I only get the job because of X quota, right? And that's just not helpful in any kind of environment anyway, is it really? I guess you talked a little bit about representation there. So we should ask the question, or start by asking, does representation matter? Who cares if a person of colour is in a leadership job or is at the leadership table? I guess my response to that is, well, actually, yeah, I do. And I do think representation is important. It's important that we have a workforce that's representative of the communities we serve. It's important that leadership is representative of the people that they're in leadership to. And it's also important for role modeling, right? So if I think back to when I was a kid, there was no LGBT representation around when I was a kid. Definitely, certainly nobody in public life, certainly nobody in my private life. But I always come back to the fact that is setting quotas the way to achieve that? And the answer is no. And I repeat for those at the back, no, quotas aren't the way to achieve representation.
I agree entirely with you, but I think to some extent, some organisations have been forced to introduce quotas because you talk about role modelling. But if there isn't role modelling in any way, shape or form in terms of behaviour, let alone any diversity, how do people know what good looks like? So it becomes systemic. And therefore people look for a quick win. And that's how we end up down the route of quotas and targets, because people think it's a sticking plaster solution. Yeah,
I mean, we've seen it in so many different walks of life, right? And different businesses, different organizations around the world. I mean, it's quite funny that, Wes Streeting from the Labour Party is criticizing this approach and saying, whilst we want top people in the boardroom, this shouldn't be the way to go about it. So he's fairly critical of the approach with quotas. It was only 10 years ago the Labour Party had all female shortlists, right, for their candidate list. So, let's not be careful when we're throwing stones here. That didn't work at the time and they wouldn't do that now. But, it's one thing, isn't it? It needs to be passed on through different walks of life. And they thought they were fixing something at the time.
They do. And we've got to go right back to historical injustice. The reality of some of this topic is deeply embedded, and why those opportunities aren't available right from education stage through the career ladder is a much bigger question than shall we over the next year change that metric.
Yeah. And I guess, I have to add a little balance here, right? Because I'm quite critical of, so it was a few episodes ago, I criticised the Welsh Government's racism action plan or whatever it was, right? And I guess part of that action plan, or part of the reason we have things like diversity quotas or positive action in that sense, I'll come back to the meanings of those in a second, is because people are trying to tackle some of that, what is perceived to be systemic racism or systemic problems with processes and systems in order to attract diverse talent into particular roles. So I guess it also flips back to what Wes Streeting was saying, which is he refuses to believe that it's a lack of talent is why, there's not enough black people in the boards at the NHS. Okay, that's a fair argument. But I guess we will cover this a bit later, but there are better ways to achieve the ends rather than the way that these NHS trusts are going about it, I would suggest. Yeah. Should we do the terminology bit? Because I'm conscious we're using language now that, might be quite confusing for people. So here in the UK, we use the term positive action, whereas in the US, they use affirmative action. Yeah. And then we use the term positive discrimination. So it's positive action versus positive discrimination. And in the US, it's affirmative action versus either positive discrimination or reverse discrimination.
Yes.
They often refer to it as in the US. And that's kind of two sides of the Atlantic, just a slightly different way of using the terminology. So what's the meanings then?
Yeah. So very simply, if we start with affirmative or positive action, what we're talking about is that we want to level the playing field. We want to create an opportunity where people from the underrepresented categorization can be encouraged to come forward for opportunities that they perhaps wouldn't. So think about a recruitment process. You'll often see in an advertisement, we would welcome applications from the disabled community or from female applicants. It's a perfectly legal in the vast majority of countries to do that positive action approach, as I say, to encourage a level playing field.
But the important bit, though, is that that's legal as well, right? So positive or affirmative.
Perfectly legal.
We'll come back to affirmative action because that's slightly different now. But it's perfectly legal here in the UK to do positive action as long as we're not giving outright preference, right? And that's the difference, isn't it?
So the reality is you can do all of that good positive action stuff up to the point of decision making.
Yeah.
So then we go into, or should go into, a robust competition in terms of candidate versus candidate.
So it's almost about the pipeline rather than the actual outcome, right? It's and that's where it should be based, is thinking about the pipeline of talent rather than thinking about which one you're selecting, because that's the key bit. That's what makes it legal. When it borders into then positive discrimination is where we're essentially making the decision based on that characteristic or that difference.
Or being even more direct in that we will only, you come back to your all-female shortlist, or we will only consider applicants from Japan.
Yeah.
You know, we are just simply discriminating.
Yeah. And I guess it's also important to say this is not just about race,
yes.
right? Because you mentioned it in your description there. You know, disability can play a part in that. It could be about representation from LGBT communities, from different parts of the world, socioeconomic status, all of that kind of stuff. So let's just go back to affirmative action, because in the States in 2023, the Supreme Court ruled that in particular college admissions, they were no longer allowed to do affirmative action. So it's now illegal in the States, whereas that's not the case here in the UK. It's illegal, and it was particularly aimed at the colleges at the time, but it's meant that a lot of organisations have also rowed back from doing affirmative action, and primarily it was about race in the States as well. I mean, I'm sure there was other bits, but it was primarily about race in the States as well. But that's now illegal as well, right?
Correct.
Yeah.
So the reality of what that means is you've got to work backwards into the process to ensure that's much more equal.
Yeah. Which I think is the right thing to do anyway. That makes a bit of sense. Okay. So what do you think are the pros and cons then for kind of positive action and positive? Because in my head, right, and I'm going to be really simple here and just say what I think other people are probably thinking or saying. So honest conversation here. You know, should we don't need to do this stuff. We shouldn't be doing this. We should only be making decisions, and we should only be making, hiring decisions based on meritocracy, experience and skill, right? Because we've had this discussion previously about Biden's pick for VP, and before he'd even decided who it was, his criteria was it had to be a woman and a person of color, right? So it leans into this. Right, okay, so you've just excluded half the population rather than whether she's experienced and blah, 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 blah. So if that's the logic, then what are the pros and why do people do this? If this is the bit that I can't get my head around. Why do people still do this thing?
I guess being really direct, we still have inequality. So we don't have an inclusive environment. So whether that be social mobility, whether that be a particular characteristic. We don't live in a world that's perfect. So people therefore feel that they're missing a role model, or they're missing an educational route, or they're missing the opportunity to compete. And I come back to the fact that some of these, of course, are historic. If we're faced with a very traditional recruitment process and a very traditional panel interview, there's a million points in that would be very biased. And therefore, I can see why people feel they've got to make those odds higher for individuals who are different.
Yeah.
But, there are pros, allegedly, in that it will speed up the achievement of those targets. It will level the playing field.
Yeah.
But I personally feel very strongly against it.
Yeah, I agree. And I'm just for balance then. So I've got a couple of the arguments against it, right? Because I have to be, I might as well just declare it. I don't believe in positive action. I think it's the wrong thing for organizations to do. I think there are far better ways to achieve your ends than those means, but that's, opinions. But things like meritocracy concerns are one of the biggest problems, I think, with this sort of stuff. The stigmatization that I've already just talked about, this reverse discrimination problem that we have where people feel excluded because of these actions and the things that you're taking, which often is the case. You're excluding a very large percentage of your workforce in that scenario, right? Which means it's going to affect your culture. It's going to affect, there's so many unseen consequences of these actions that are well-intended, but give you some much wider negative consequences for your organization. And I fear for a lot of that sort of stuff. And then to top all of that off, it's a temporary solution, right? It doesn't actually fix. It's fixing a symptom as opposed to the root cause problem. So if I go back to that point about the Labour Party and their all-female shortlist, I remember being very vocal at the time and saying to people, that is the wrong choice. And if you're asking yourself, why are women not applying to be members of parliament, then look at the root cause issues rather than try and fix the symptoms. So is it because you're expecting them to work till 10, 11 o'clock at night doing votes? Is it because you don't have childcare facilities? Is it because the environment's pretty awful environment to work in when it comes to behaviour? These are the kind of things. Fix those, and then maybe more women would apply to become members of parliament. And I think there's been a lot of progress in that in the UK parliament for sure in the last few years. So I think that's a positive. But that's kind of where I'm at. It's just a temporary solution anyway.
No, I agree entirely. And, there's two strands we need to come at here. Of course, we need to go right back to education and making sure that from being 3 or 4 years of age, that we've got an inclusive society. But referring back to an episode we talked about a few weeks ago and going back to the equation that we swear by, which is the input equals an output equals an outcome, which then leads to an impact. If we take the example of a female-only shortlist and we look at the output being inevitably we're going to appoint a female, you've talked already about tokenism and the individual probably struggling in the role because they haven't got the skills and experience, which embeds the stereotype of people don't stay. But don't forget the impact, because we've got all of the colleagues who are making a decision with their feet to leave because they feel that unless they are of a particular diversity, they won't progress. Or they're quietly quitting and their productivity reduces dramatically. Or they make life very difficult for that post holder and therefore they don't succeed. And therefore the impact of all of those things and many more are having such a big business detrimental effect that we go back to, well, was the input-output worth it?
Yeah. And what was the impact of the whole thing? Yeah, exactly. And I guess that's the biggest thing that. And look, I'll try and be balanced in this. Part of the reason that organisations, I believe, have leaned into these things like diversity quotas, some of it, and I'll come back to this, is driven by governments as an example. So I'll pause that for a second. But some of it is being driven by people who are well-intended and have been appointed D&I experts in their organisations, but don't actually know what they're doing, right? And, you and I are firm believers in the fact that doing something around inclusion in your organisation is actually culture change. culture change is really difficult to achieve and to do properly in established organizations. And therefore, it needs to be done well with people with the right skills and the right training in order to make it stick, and to consider a whole systems approach rather than I'm going to do this bit over here in isolation and hope that that fixes the problem. Because what you end up with, to your point about impact, is consequences elsewhere in the system that nobody was prepared for and nobody planned for. Mm-hmm. And this is the problem. And it's not me having a go at D&I experts, because they're all well intended. But I come back to the leaders, and you should be asking yourselves, are the people you're tasking with this work and who are advising you to set diversity quotas in the first place, do they have the right skills to be able to lead this type of work? Because I have a big question mark over whether they do.
But I think you're asking a fundamental question of why this topic is so emotive right now. Because to create a culture, there are 150 touch points. Yeah. And I know I get immensely boring about this point. But culture isn't just, one-dimensional. It's a multitude of things. Yeah. And if you ask the average DEI professional, what are those 150 things? They couldn't answer the question. Yeah. So when we come down to the real basics, we talk about the layered interventions, but we're right down to every individual aspect. Do we know what good looks like around this stuff? Do we know what a good culture feels like? Do we know what behaviour we should be presenting every day? Yeah. Have we got the bottle to challenge people who aren't presenting that behaviour? How often do you have somebody who's quite subservient on a recruitment panel who won't challenge the other people on the panel when they know that the other candidate would have been better? Yeah. I could go on and on and on, but we've got to put those basics right.
But it's worrying too, right? Mm-hmm. So some of these companies that we're referring to here who have done this, or they've been advised by people who don't have that experience, don't have that knowledge and that skill set, all well intended, but they've done this stuff. These are some of the biggest companies in the world, right? And people rely on those companies for jobs and income and mortgages, and economies are reliant on some of these big companies. And I think, my gosh, this is quite scary that this kind of stuff is happening. Yeah. And then it just plays into this narrative around why, DEI is too woke, and why, go woke, go broke, all of this kind of stuff. And it's really worrying when I see that, because actually this stuff is important and it can be done really, really well when it's done properly. But when it's done badly, that's what we get. We get that.
I agree. We also have to apply some patience to this too, because there's some historic connotations in this. Being really stereotypical, think about some of the professions that are very male-dominated. Why is that? Because when people were sat around the dinner table at 11 years of age and they were saying, I want to work on a building site or be a plumber, or I want to do this, families were discouraging them from doing those things. Yeah. So again, we've got to appreciate there's almost a re-education piece here. If you look at how many, I remember once being asked why there were so few black tax accountants available in a recruitment process. And this was a few years ago, but it piqued an interest. And I went away and had a look, and there was 3 in the country at the time. Yeah. And I said, so are you saying you only want to target those 3 individuals? Yeah. And, this is how silly.
Talk about limit your talent pool, right?
This is how silly this topic can get. Yeah. And so I think we've got to apply some really good quality work, layered interventions, and some common sense and patience. Yeah. I know I'm always the boring one who talks about common sense, but we have to make sure that we're doing this properly. Yeah, for sure. And, we'll get into remedies shortly, I'm sure, but there are multiple remedies.
So just before we jump into remedies, because I do want to go there next, let's just talk about some of the government stuff, because there are different governments around the world that have implemented. Quotas are probably the wrong word for it, but they've put targets in place or recommended targets in place for for companies to abide by. So I'm thinking here in the UK, we have things like the gender pay gap, right? So that's not a bad thing. I'm not saying I'm critical of the gender pay gap. We need to shorten that gap. And there was always the threat that with that, it's going to come some target at some point you've got to try and achieve. Hasn't yet come. But the fact that they've put a bit of focus on it has meant organizations are focusing on it. So something like that can have a good impact and have a good outcome. There are other countries around the world. So I think of the Netherlands as a good example here, where they have it's a bit of a quota, isn't it? It's like 1/3 of their board needs to either be male or female. So you've got to have a 1/3 proportion on your board as a minimum for listed companies, right? So companies that are on the stock exchange over there.
Supervisory board.
Yeah, exactly. So, and those kind of things, look, you can argue all day long about whether they're the right things or the wrong things, but what they inevitably do is they then drive behaviors, right? Because if you want to change behavior, one of the key things to do is give it a target, right? And to hell with the consequences, people will go after that target. So we need to be really mindful of that. And I think, again, I come back to this point of governments fell into the same trap that organizations fell into when well-meaning, well-intended individuals were advising them, oh, we should probably put a quota in place, or we should probably put a target in place, and these kind of things. And, dare I say it, same principle applies, right?
But we talk all the time about leading and lagging indicators, and any target and any reporting of numbers is always lagging. It's always history. So why... I don't see the complexity around switching the view.
Yeah.
But I think, again, that comes from looking for a quick win.
Yeah.
The target certainly focuses the mind, but it focuses the mind on the wrong things.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting, right? So I had a client once, it's quite a funny story, but who was talking to me about their gender pay gap, and they were really focused on this gender pay gap because they had to do it. And then he rang me up and said, Craig, I want to talk to you. This is ridiculous. Our gender pay gap, it's gone backwards. What on earth is happening? And I said to him, well, of course it's gone backwards. And he said, why has it gone backwards? I said, well, you've just recruited more female apprentices than you've ever recruited before because you're trying to hit more gender in the workplace target, right? So if you're going to recruit more apprentices on less money, then the pay gap's going to widen for a short period of time, right? And then eventually it'll catch up when they get through their training and stuff. But when you were planning that stuff, did you not plan for this spike in the gap to go? And he was like, oh, I hadn't put two and two together. They were just two separate things for me. And I thought that's just classic, isn't it? That's just how organizations will go a target for that and a target for that, just go from without realizing actually both targets are going to impact each other.
And it comes back to this topic not being viewed as a strategic topic, doesn't it?
Yeah. Okay. All right. Well, I think we've rabbited on enough about that. So let's do the so what then. What should organizations do? I'm particularly keen to answer two questions here. So one is, what should we do if we're not going to do quotas and go down this road of positive action, which you and I think is a bit too risky? Just don't bother with it and do other things instead. What should they do? And then the second question I want to ask is, what if they've already got a quota in place? What should they do now? Because that's a really tough question. If it's already there, how do you row back from that without sounding like you're completely changing your mind on something?
Yeah, sure. So the first thing to say is that where we have had the opportunity to put an inclusion program in place, and I'll walk through the how to, it has had a greater impact at a much greater speed on diversity than a diversity target of any kind. Yeah. So that's a really key point first and foremost.
You've got a live client that literally improved their female representation. Was it by about 17%? And
Absolutely.
They never talked about diversity once?
Not once.
Brilliant.
We removed it from the vocabulary.
Yeah. And it completely went up by 17%, and you never mentioned the word diversity once.
No.
Brilliant.
And it became from a very, very male-dominated environment to be a very natural, diverse environment.
Brilliant.
For multiple characteristics, not just female.
And we've got a case study, so if people want it, drop us a note and we'll share the case study.
It's massively impactful.
Yeah, it's really good.
So to do that, you've got to put some basics in place, first of all. You've got to put your guide rails in terms of what are those leading behaviours we need to have in place. And simple, you will not and you will do.
Yeah.
So we talk about scales, we talk about codes of conduct of how to embed that behaviour. We also talk about the need for and consistent theme education and training, whether that be, and we'll stick on the recruitment theme, really good quality hiring manager training, so that when people are faced with those difficult decisions, I've got two candidates who are equally good, one's black, one's white. Obviously, I'm going to go with the black one. So again, how do we navigate those kinds of situations?
Sorry, to interrupt you. I really want to just use an example here that has just come back into my mind, and I think will be really helpful for people to remember. This is the story about a bank, and I won't name the bank because I may get it wrong, so I'll avoid naming it. But there was a bank where they had two candidates going for a promotion to a director role of some kind. One was black, one was white. They put them through the process, both very similar skills, both very similar experience, been at the bank a long time, all of that kind of good stuff. And they opted for the black candidate. And then the white candidate took them to court and an employment tribunal and won her case for discrimination. And the bank said, hang on a minute, no, we're going to fight this. And they went to court and they fought it and said, no, they were both at the right level and we made the choice, blah, blah, blah. And the judges at the employment tribunal said, yes, but you can't demonstrate how you made the decision. Yeah. And so they went through this process, both equal candidates in terms of experience, skills, and they still lost their case at employment tribunal because they just couldn't demonstrate how they made the final decision. So in that scenario, what should they have done as an organisation?
It's really simple. Recruitment is a competition. It's a competition until there's a winner.
Yeah.
And you keep going until you've differentiated who the winner is.
Yeah. So put in another stage.
Layer in.
Yeah, another stage.
Absolutely.
Or another exercise. Yeah.
Yeah. And don't let that be meet the team or let's go out for dinner.
Fireside chat.
Yeah, I was reading an article today about whether you drink your water or not in an interview or determine whether you're assertive or not.
Goodness.
You know, madness.
But it is interesting, isn't it, that they lost that case, and the only reason they lost that case is because they couldn't demonstrate how they made that final decision between the two candidates who were of equal standing. And so had they put in just another round or another round after that, then they would have been able to demonstrate that and they would have won the case, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah. Sorry, anyway, I cut you off mid-flow.
So coming back to remedies, we've put our guide rails in place, we've got our rules, we've trained everybody in what that means and how to demonstrate it. We then need to expose people to difference, because if our biased heads are only exposed to certain things, they will naturally be drawn to those. We know that. So again, introducing things like community mentoring programs or meeting focus groups, meeting individuals from different backgrounds, so it becomes much more natural. Embedding things like mentoring programs throughout the different levels of the ladder within the organisation, whether it be reverse mentoring or traditional mentoring, and supporting genuinely those individuals who have not had previous exposure to training, development, etc., by simply introducing a self-nomination process and allowing individuals who want to explore different opportunities the opportunity to, without needing the signature of a manager who may be holding that talent down already. As people progress, we train them properly. We make sure that we are consciously making the decision of who's going into the roles based on merit.
Okay. And how do you feel about development programs or training programs specifically aimed at underrepresented groups like people of colour, for example, or whatever?
In the 80s, this was hugely relevant. in terms of you used to, and I still see programs now for, disabled leaders, women as leaders. All we do is compound the stereotypes by doing these siloed programs. The principles of leadership are common regardless of who we are. Are you a toxic leader? Are you an emotionally intelligent leader? Are you a compassionate leader? Are you a bullying leader? All of these elements that we display can be equally displayed regardless of any characteristics. So the leadership principles are there. I also am respectful that different thinking styles, different backgrounds in education add a great dimension, particularly around risk or product development or challenge. And of course, we need that. But we also need the skills to support the appointment, not just that singular point of failure.
Yeah.
So, I'm not a fan. I believe a leadership program should be a leadership program, and we respect within that there will be different types of leader.
Yeah, I'm with you on that. Same principle as the recruitment process for me. I just think there's just no point. The consequences of doing it far outweigh any benefits that you might get as a result of specifically targeting it at one group over another. I guess the other point to that is evidence tells us as well that it doesn't become self-perpetuating as well. And I think I've mentioned this before. There was a study done where people believed if they put more women into these roles, they'll recruit more women and it'll be fine. And actually, they didn't. Women ended up recruiting more men, right?
Absolutely.
So this idea that if we just kick it off or we give it a nudge in the first place, it'll self-perpetuate just doesn't exist. And it's not true either. The evidence points in the opposite direction. And to your point, it's far better to be focused on what does good leadership look like and let's develop whoever's ready for that program on that stuff in the first place. I'm a huge fan of two other things just to add into your bit. So you talked about one, which was the focus groups. I love that because I think focus groups, if you don't have, so take the case of this NHS trust doing these recruitment quotas, right, for people of colour. And part of their argument is we don't have the representation at leadership level. Well, then get it through a focus group, right? If you can't attract the talent in the first place, you could easily put together a focus group to give you that representation. So representation can come from different ways. It doesn't have to be a person in position in the short term. And then in the long term, obviously you'd hope to fill that position and you could then get that representation up. But there's other ways of doing that. The other thing I really love is when big organizations have started going out to schools and universities and stuff and encouraging talent from different groups into specific roles. So essentially what they're trying to fix is the pipeline of talent rather than fix the outcome. And they're now trying to encourage, 10-year-olds to be builders or engineers or whatever and enter these kind of STEM subjects. So science, technology, engineering, maths, those kind of subjects that are traditionally male orientated. They're trying to encourage more women into those roles. And I love that because that's a bit CSR for me as well, right? This community payback stuff, this real kind of rooted in community. It's just two birds, right? One stone. And I just love those kind of things.
Anything that creates exposure and knowledge. Love that.
Have we done enough? Have we given them enough tips at this stage?
Yeah, I want to come back to that second question because I've got a lovely live example of this.
Go for it then.
What do we do if we've got quotas in place? Nobody's budging on letting us move them.
Yeah.
So my advice here is that you've got to take a bit of a pincer movement here. Don't give up on trying to educate the people who've set the target that's actually having a negative impact. And in this particular case, their staff survey is screaming it at them that it is. Yeah. So keep pushing that door, but come back to the leading and lagging indicators. So build all of the scaffolding around your strategy that we've talked about whilst still doing your reporting. And what you'll see if you're following that inclusion remedy, you will ultimately see the figures alter. And if your leadership want to pat themselves on the back and say it's as a result of the quota, well, let them get on with it.
Yeah.
But you have the strategy in
It's
place.
interesting, isn't it? Because 90% of our clients who we work with use the return on inclusion methodology anyway, so they don't have quotas in place. But even if they did have quotas in place, the return on inclusion methodology, one of the recommendations would be remove the quotas, right? Take the quotas away. So actually, the evidence to their leadership would be there in the return on inclusion audit, because the return on inclusion audit would essentially say, we still think this is the wrong thing to do. You should remove it and focus on these other things instead anyway. So those individuals who are trying to encourage their leaders to step away from a quota, they can use the hard evidence of what does an inclusive organization look like. And our tool would recommend that they remove diversity quotas anyway.
And this is where we start to talk different language. We then talk in financial impact, people impact, commercial impact. So absolutely, that's the sophistication.
There you go. I think we've answered it for people. But if not, then you can ask us a question. Absolutely. So we're going on to listeners' questions now. So the fabulous Lewis is going to bring us our unopened envelope of questions. This, for those of you who may be joining us for the first time, this is the part in the show where we hand the microphone over to you and we open up for listeners' questions. We don't get sight of these questions in advance. They come in a sealed envelope, so uncited and uncensored responses too. Thank you, Lewis. Very kind.
I don't like, Lewis, how you keep giving them to Craig.
It's all right. It's all good. I don't mind it. And I've got some news about questions and how listeners can get in touch next time as well. So let's have a look. Oh, the one is from Jiminy Cricket. I reckon somebody didn't want to be named here, and that's why they put their name down as Jiminy Cricket. So the question is, why do you think the media are so anti-DEI at the moment?
Yeah, I think number one, it's a nice, easy target. Yeah. It will fill column inches quite easily. It's relatively easily understandable as to why to berate it. But when you dig below, there's no substance to the reporting. And I think it's topical and it's emotive. So it's everything a journalist wants.
Yeah, these things come and go as well. Yeah. I think, if we remember back to when Black Lives Matter happened a long time ago, on the back of the murder of George Floyd, a lot of our clients were ringing and saying, oh, what should we do? What should we do? And we said, look, at this stage, you shouldn't say anything. We would hold your water, for want of a better description, because unless you've done the hard yards and the cultural change stuff, you shouldn't really be shouting about anything from the rooftops until you've done the hard yard works. And actually that paid off for our clients in the end, because some organizations who made big public declarations were then named and shamed because they hadn't done the hard yards. And I would give people exactly the same advice today is, look, these things, take note, don't ignore them, take note of them, but focus on doing the hard changes and don't focus on knee-jerk reactions to things. It's not helpful.
Focus on the restorative and the rebuilding messages.
Yeah. Okay. So this next one this is a really interesting question, actually. This is from Alice. Doesn't say where Alice is from, but it says, should we be marking International Women's Day this year?
Yeah, it's a really interesting one. I mean, the topic actually for International Women's Day this year is about action and impact.
Okay.
So
that's nice.
I like that. I think the reality around the world is that International Women's Day is shared in different ways. Yeah. So if we keep focused on the theme of impact, I'm slightly less reluctant than I would normally be to the celebration. Yeah. But keep it true. We need lots of male allies in there. We need to be mindful we're not doing anything patronising towards female, but we also need to be culturally appropriate.
Yeah. I'd agree. I don't have any issues with people celebrating things like International Women's Day. I think as long as your strategies are not grounded in one thing, it's okay to do some of that celebration stuff. And as long as you are actually taking action and making impact, then it's fine. And I've been invited to go to a meeting for International Women's Day as a male ally and all of that good stuff. And I will 100% be attending as a result of that. So, go for it, Alice. Enjoy and have fun. But don't forget the theme of action and impact.
Yeah, and serve cake.
Yes, and lots of cake. And I don't mind a glass of wine or two either if you're offering. Okay, next one is from Laura in London, and she says, oh, I love this. If you could both implement any intervention to improve inclusion into any organisation, what would it be and why?
Oh.
Ooh, so hard.
Nah, it's not.
Go on, what would it be?
Measure it.
Oh, okay.
Measure the impact.
Yeah, but I think she's asking about an intervention rather than the measurement. So what intervention would you put in place?
So I would, first of all, remove the word diversity.
Okay, love that. Love that. I'd agree with that. I'm going to say something different then. I would say implement speak up.
Ooh.
If you could do one thing, encourage your people to talk to you. Put speak up in place and do it well. Maybe that's a future episode.
Sounds good.
Right. Okay, brilliant. Well, that's the questions for this week. It is now time, well, it will be in a second, time for our recurring feature. Before we do that, I've got an update on questions. So, obviously, the dear Evan left us, so he's no longer using Evan's email address anymore. We've got a new email address for people to contact us with questions or comments about the pod. You don't just have to be a question. If you just want to tell us you're really enjoying the pod, you can do that too. But you can email us at podcast@metamer.global. So that's podcast@metamer.global. And we've now got WhatsApp as well. So people can WhatsApp us by sending us a WhatsApp message or a WhatsApp voice note. And they can do that by using the number 07482 974 726. Or if you're dialing internationally and you're not in the UK, add +44 and drop the 0. So it's +44 7482 974 726. Send us your comments, send us your questions.
And how many countries?
Oh, what was the total number?
19.
19 different countries have been listening to us. So thank you very much for listening. Share it with your friends. Hit the subscribe button and all of that good stuff. And send us some nice comments or some nice questions and we'll feature you in next episode.
Absolutely.
Okay, so now recurring feature, woke or joke time. And it's your turn, I believe.
I've been scouring, so I've got me bit of paper.
I don't know why. You're beating me hands down anyway, right?
So, is it true
Go on.
that a Bavarian company had to pay compensation of €2,500 to a rejected applicant as the applicant's rejection letter stated that the tasks to be performed were rather something for nimble female hands, which is why he could not be considered in the selection process?
Sorry, you're going to have to read that to me again. Say it again.
So we've got a company in Bavaria who have had to pay compensation to a recruitment applicant.
Right.
The applicant's rejection letter said that the tasks that would be needed to be performed and the reason they weren't successful was that it was rather something for nimble female hands. This was a male applicant.
So he was told he can't get the job because he would have male hands and they wanted nimble hands.
Absolutely.
No, that can't be true, can it? No, nobody's that stupid to put that in a rejection letter, surely. I'm going to say that's a joke.
It's true.
Oh, no. Who would write that in a letter? That's so random.
Yeah. I mean, who would? But I have seen worse.
Oh, no.
Yeah.
Oh, God. Maybe we'll just do a spin-off pod one time with just all the worst things we've seen in this space.
Absolutely. That would be funny.
All right. Okay. Well, another point to you. I'll have to do it next time.
So on that WhatsApp, if you could just share with me where we should go for dinner, because I'm winning hands down.
Yeah, it's going to cost me a fortune at this rate, I think. Okay. So that's it for another episode of You Must Be Woking. Thank you so much for listening and for all your lovely comments we've had over the last few weeks. It's been really lovely to see from all of the different countries you're listening from. Don't forget to get in touch with your questions or comments in the future using our new details, all of which are in the show notes. And you can hit the subscribe button. And if you're feeling really generous, leave us a lovely review because it really is the best way to get the message out to everybody else. But that's it for this time. Until then, it's bye from me.
And bye from me.
This episode is brought to you by Meritocracy, the online platform that measures inclusion. The Meritocracy platform moves beyond the DEI initiatives and allows businesses to measure the real-time impact on culture as well as their financial impact on their bottom line. The Meritocracy platform is a collaboration between data scientists, digital experts, and cultural change experts to bring substance to the topic of diversity and inclusion in the workplace. It's time for businesses to move past diversity quotas and start understanding the real impact and opportunities of an inclusive culture. To find out more, visit www.meritocracy.global.